Chapter 6. A whole new ball game. Above the stage in the grand hall of the castle, there was a huge clock. On every hour the clock would chime. Exactly as it was chiming 8, 2 serving men walked down the centre of the hall, up the steps to the great doors, and swung them open. There waited a great crowd of people. The more ordinary folk, or, to put it less politely, peasants, a select number of whom had been graciously given tickets to the ball, were gossiping and gasping at the decor of the castle. The more fashionable were quieter, and generally further back, apart from Bernice and Wolsey, who were at the very front of the crowd. The master of ceremonies raised an eyebrow at them as he pulled a roll of parchment from his sleeve and made his way to a little lectern by the doorway, obviously sooner than he had expected. "The Princess Bernice," he announced to the empty room, "and Wolsey, the cat." Bernice and Wolsey marched down the steps, Bernice feeling rather embarrassed. She didn't know the etiquette of such things, and she had been eager to get the evening started. Enjoying gowns of all kinds as she did, she was still getting used to the scaffolding that was holding her skirts up, not to mention stays so tight that she had actually developed breasts. The shoes were a bit impractical too. They were made of glass, and so Benny was taking tiny steps, aware that putting her foot down too hard, let alone any attempt at disco, could create a horrible ankle hemorrhaging situation. She managed to navigate the dress into a sitting position, and she and Wolsey took their places at the head table as commoners filled the room, obviously cowed by their surroundings. Wolsey gazed around at the vast number of place settings, the huge dance floor at one end of the room, and the great stage. "The king's balls get bigger every year," he purred. "See? You don't need the dick jokes," Bernice whispered back. The MC cleared his throat. "Dane Candy," he called. Then, a moment later, as if under severe duress, "with nobody. As yet." Across the floor glided Candy, in a vastly petticoated dress, with polka-dot socks, a huge conical bustier, and a 6-foot pile of beehived hair. Her face was pink with makeup. "What do you think?" she asked Bernice and Wolsey, thumping down into her seat. "A bit too subtle, maybe? I didn't want anything that said, 'Come and get me.'" "That certainly doesn't," Wolsey smiled. "The 7... The MC paused, made a little cough. Then through clenched teeth he continued, "The 7 dwarves." A ripple of distaste ran through the crowd. In a line, the dwarves marched proudly into the hall, Moody at their head. They were wearing evening dress in very small sizes. Moody had selected a powerful double-breasted jacket. Bernice realized that, now he was a dwarf, he was human, and his arms were in the usual place. Bitchy had the most fabulous black gown. Gushy was wearing a lavender dress with long gloves, and Liberal had chosen a muted fawn trouser suit. Laddish looked like a bouncer, with a silly red bow tie. The only one who hadn't dressed for the occasion was Lazy, who was just wearing his usual dwarfit doublet. Cute was at the back of the group, being the littlest. He waved enthusiastically to Benny. He had had his hair done and was wearing the cutest little tuxedo. Bernice slapped herself across the face. Hard. This was pathetic. That little being lived for her, adored her, wanted her close to him so completely and utterly. If that was what Michael Dorham was really like, then how could she ever have considered going to bed with him? In the real world, she was a lonely woman, approaching middle age, who had pathetically grabbed at her first and probably last chance of happiness. An empty boy with a cute smile. Perhaps she should stay here. Moody glanced around the gathering with a sneer, turned to his fellows and raised his fist in a power salute. "Hi!" he shouted. They saluted back. "Ho!" Moody spun on his heel and led the dwarves towards Bernice's table. Gushy took the seat next to Bernice. Gosh, you do look pretty in your dress. Cute, to Bernice's trepidation, sat down on the other side of her. She's beautiful, he sighed. Bernice concentrated on the doorway. The crowd don't seem to be entirely happy with your presence, Wolsey observed to the dwarves. Vamplephobia, spat Moody. There is a lot of post-dwarf and even anti-dwarf feeling, Liberal explained. Even amongst the dwarf community. Some say that we should abandon dwarf as a social construct altogether and just get on with being short. Could be because of the ogre, Laddish interjected. Last year he was guilty of a number of unnecessary actions which went well beyond the spirit of the game. He went round killing people, said Bitchy, and tried to blame it on us, because he killed each of them in the manner of one of our names. Well, 6 of them anyway. He decided that the best way to incriminate Lazy was not to bother. Ogre? Bernice perked up. There's an ogre in this kingdom that actually kills people. He's a bad sort. Candy put her hand on Bernice's sleeve. But he doesn't exactly live round here. Then where? But Bernice's question was interrupted by another cry from the MC. Prince Charming. The prince was dressed in an extraordinary costume. He wore a long military coat and a pair of breeches with a peacock waistcoat, a red sash and a cummerbund. He marched down the steps, glancing around the room proudly, aware of the attention and adulation he was getting. After a moment of feigned uncertainty, doubtless to allow the commoners to gaze on him some more, he spun on his heel and headed for Bernice's table. He hitched one foot up onto a spare chair, slapped his thigh and grinned at her. What do you think of the get-up? Bernice slid her fan from her sleeve and tapped his boot with it gently, looking him up and down. Ridicule, she told him, is nothing to be scared of. He laughed indulgently and took his seat opposite her, earning a glare from Cute. From the other side of the room there came a fanfare. The majority of the other guests had arrived. Candy pointed out 2 of them to Bernice, women in huge platform shoes with extraordinary wigs, garish makeup, and vast dresses. They were as well endowed as Candy was. 2 of my lot, sisters, if I remember rightly. I must speak to them later. Your lot? Dames. You know, ladies of a certain age. Yes, laughed Wolsey, draining his first champagne stem of the night. Too old. Then he stopped in mid-sip, his ears visibly pricking up as his gaze chanced upon one of the new arrivals. I say, hello. Bernice followed his eye line. Through the crowd was moving another humanoid cat. This one wore an elegant lace gown, the same silver as her fur. On her feet were a dainty little pair of boots. Puss in Boots, murmured Wolsey. I've warned you about your language before, Liberal told him. That's her name. Wolsey rose to his feet, purring, and adjusted his cravat. I had heard that another of my kind would be coming to this ball, but I could scarcely hope that she would be so soft-furred and silver. He rubbed his paws together. Let's hope she hasn't been neutered, eh? Bernice tapped him gently with her fan. Hold on. Last time you contemplated romance, it was between 2 rubbish skips and resulted in a very angry neighbour and 6 kittens. I don't know what you're talking about, said Wolsey, his eyes locked on his target. If you'll excuse me. And he slunk off in the direction of the female cat. Bernice sighed. I should have taken him to the vet when I had the chance. The MC was announcing some more arrivals. Young Jack from the village. Son! Cried Candy, leaping to her feet. She ran across to the tousle-haired boy, enveloped him in her enormous bosom, and then led him, stunned, back to Bernice's table. This is my good-for-nothing. She stopped and considered the circumstances. My heroic son Jack, who sent that ogre packing. "Oh, Ma!" Jack slapped his rather balletic thigh. "I only noticed that the murders had all been carried out by someone over 9 feet high, and thus couldn't possibly be the work of any individual dwarf." "It was nothing." Moody slapped his palms with the lad. "Dwarf brother." "So," Jack sat down and turned to Bernice, "you've met my mother." Bernice noticed something very odd about Jack. He didn't have an Adam's apple. Oh boy. Or rather not. This was getting very complicated. "Yes," she said. "She's so feminine. It must be a family trait." "Robert of Huntingdon," the MC announced. This was a dashing young man in green cape and cavalier moustache. He was evidently in charge of the evening's entertainment, because behind him were gathered a group of musicians in hooded capes, carrying large drums, violin cases, and other boxed instruments. Robert was pointing out various features of the hall to them. They fell back as Princess Marion ran to greet Robert. To Bernice's relief, he wasn't given a place at her table. The king, in Cupid mode, had ordered that one be set for him beside Marion. Obviously, the idea was to take her thoughts away from that Robin person. A great shadow swept over the table, and everybody looked up. The vizier was standing there, a look of ecstasy on his face, his fingers curled in appreciation. "My dear, you look wonderful," he cried, looking right down Bernice's newly created chest. "Your beauty, princess, is like the truth itself." "Yes," Bernice smiled sweetly back at him. "It's hard to get hold of, and you're never going to see all of it." The vizier had a male throat. He still carried that strange hissing sound with him. Bernice suddenly looked around. She could swear that she'd heard somebody shouting something. Boom? Boots? Maybe Puss had admirers other than Wolsey. She had finally pinned down what was strange about the vizier, at least. Unlike all the others here, a number of whom were strangely familiar, she was certain that she'd never met him. She would have recognized somebody who looked that unusual instantly. And he looked unusual because he wasn't quite real. Everybody else had blemishes and wrinkles and all the minor defects of humanity. He was perfect, stylized, sketched like an animated character. What was he doing here? The vizier and all the other assembled suitors glowered as a huge man in a lumberjack shirt carrying an axe over his shoulder stamped up to the table and grinned at them. "Hello," he cried. "I'm John Wood, the woodsman. Now, where can I put my chopper?" "Oh, over here," called Candy, patting the seat next to her. She turned to whisper in Bernice's ear, "Ooh, isn't he bold?" Bernice ticked another one off her list. Male features on the woodsman. Wolsey led his new feline acquaintance back to the table, arm in arm with her. This vision in feline splendour is Puss. "Puss, this is my master, that is, my mistress, the Princess Bernice." "Charmed." Puss curtsied. She indicated the gauche young man, done up in the most expensive finery, but looking as if he was a bad actor playing a part. He stood a little way back, but was gazing at Bernice with that star-struck, near-comatose look that she was getting used to from these men. "This is my master, the Marquis de Sharp." "Right, pleased, I mean charmed." The Marquis stepped forward, slapped his thigh, and bowed deeply, kissing Bernice's knuckle, from which position she got a good look at his throat. And no Adam's apple there either, as Bernice had now come to expect. He straightened up. "So, cracking ball tonight, eh?" He took his place at the table, and Bernice studied the faces of her potential suitors. There was no doubt about it. 2 of these lads were decidedly girlish. There had been times in her life when that wouldn't have been too much of a problem, but here, such confusions seemed to be more a matter of style than lifestyle. The fanfare rang out again. "All rise," the MC commanded, "for His Majesty King Rupert." The audience got to their feet. The king, in a smart uniform and garish waistcoat, strode into the middle of the dining area and spread his arms wide. "Greetings, my friends. You are welcome to my hospitality. Eat, drink, enjoy yourselves. This ball is for my daughter, Princess Bernice, that she may find a husband." Everybody in the room looked at Bernice and clapped. Wolsey leant close to her ear and whispered, "No pressure." Extract from the diary of Bernice Summerfield. Closure, apart from being that point at the end of a Shakespeare play where everybody is either dead or married, is the mind's ability to make conclusions about things that it hasn't directly experienced. For instance, if you throw a rock over a wall and then you hear a crash, you're not going to stand there thinking, "I wonder what caused that." Well, you might, but that's denial, and that's not what I'm talking about here. As they cleared away the food from the tables, and the band that Robert of Huntingdon had brought along began to play, I found myself thinking that I was on my way to being a victim of closure in both senses. First, that the king seemed determined to have me married off, determined to create an ending. For some reason, I was very worried about that, almost afraid of it. I had the instinctive feeling that closure would somehow be the end of everything. Secondly, that I felt that I was in danger of hopping from one moment to another, much later, something meaningful having happened in between. After all, I'd already fallen asleep as one person, as far as these people were concerned, and woken up as somebody else. I had thought that the people here were all robots, because they seemed to change their mind to order. But if they were, then whoever or whatever program was controlling them would be able to change all of their minds, to have them come to a unanimous decision about whether I was a man or a woman. And why would female robots disguise themselves as men and vice versa, for no good reason? I felt that I was missing a very big point. So I came up with a plan. It employed one of my general rules. These aren't the sort of rules which one makes up deliberately and sorts one's life out with. These are the sorts of rules which govern your behaviour, but which aren't immediately obvious to you. The sort of little behavioural quirk that you look back on and think, yes, that's very like me. It's very like me when I have to pick one thing out of a number of different and conflicting options to try to do all of them. This rule has led to my having a romantic dinner, for instance, whilst proofreading under the table, and continually running out to call the drone that I'd left in my ship's cargo bay to pack my dig tools. People tell me it's irritating, but there you are. If I didn't do everything, I might miss something. That's why I, who had become allergic to engagements, decided suddenly, whilst diplomatically having the first dance of the evening with Wolsey, to gorge myself on them. "I'm going to accept the prince's hand in marriage," I told him. Give the cat credit, he only missed a single step. Around us, the whole enormous dance floor was full of spinning couples and the rustle of taffeta against petticoat. He probably didn't want to make a scene. "That's a big decision," he whispered. "Not really. I want to see what happens if I move so fast that all these intentions and stories and attempts at closure get mixed up. Maybe we'll get to see what's really going on. When I do this," and I made a chopping motion with my hand, "I want you to distract the prince." He looked rather put out. And I was doing so well with Puss. "The night is young. I'm sure you get to smell each other's bottoms later." "Ah, my prince!" I smiled invitingly as the prince swished up, and allowed him to cut in, swapping his partner, one of the sisters that Candy had pointed out earlier, with Wolsey. "You dance so well. Why? I am rather thinking of marrying you." "What? You are?" He stopped dancing there and then, and this being one of those sorts of ball, everybody else stopped dancing too. "Please, sir, spare my blushes," I gasped, fluttering my fan fiercely and taking his shoulder again to lead him back into the dance before he slapped his thigh. Everybody else resumed dancing. "Sorry, I'm so overwhelmed. This is the happiest day of my life." He took a ring from his jacket and slipped it on my finger. I must tell father. Just give me a few moments while I prepare myself for the big announcement, I told him. You just keep on dancing, Charming. And I sped off into the crowd, leaving him smiling. I headed in the direction of the powder room, which in this world would probably be just that, for a moment, and slipped the ring from my finger and into my corset. Then I changed tack, cutting in on where Candy was dancing with John Wood, knocking him to and fro with swings of her dangerous bosoms. She gave me such a glare as she marched off. I like the cut of your jib, Axeman, I told the bearded, muscular man. Fancy tying the knot? Why, aye, lady, that I do, he cried. Listen, everybody. He was about to boom his delight out to the crowd until I slapped a hand across his chops. Do not, I advised, for I require one moment to gather myself. He nodded, and I let go. He produced a ring and tried to get down on one knee, but I sort of jollied him to his feet and accepted the ring on my finger with a little curtsy. Cheers. See you in a bit. On the other side of the room, I caught sight of the prince marching towards his father, his face alight with joy. Luckily, Wolsey was almost beside him. I made the cutting motion, and my cat nodded back to me. If only he was this obedient in ordinary life. I dashed off to find another potential suitor, dropping this ring down to join the other one. Diary entry ends. Wolsey caught the prince's sleeve as he was heading for the king and glared at him haughtily. I've been meaning to have a few words with you. Later, perhaps, the prince smiled. This cannot wait. Wolsey made the hair along his spine stand on end, his tail swishing dangerously beneath his coat-tails. I have been confused ever since I got here. What with all these strange shifts in personality and point of view? I doubt you'll explain anything to me, no matter how much I ask. So, I have come to an important conclusion. What? Wolsey paused for a moment, wondering just what he could do to stop the young man from reaching the king. Any accusation or threat could be swiftly countered. It might even result in the king being dragged into the argument and Wolsey being thrown out of the palace. Then he had an idea. As long as he had lived, there had always been one way to bring the action around him to a complete halt. That I'll never be like human people, he told the prince. Let me explain. He turned to the dancers who had, as he had expected, all stopped to look at him as he began to sing. The band on stage struck up a jaunty melody that just happened to fit his words exactly. He came along, he saved us at the cottage. He grabbed my mistress for a bit of frottage. That's when I caught his eye. Bernice had meanwhile cornered Jack the commoner and told him that his accent intrigued her, and therefore immediate matrimony was on the cards. He had given her another ring, which he'd added to the collection before moving on. As Wolsey started to sing, she was accepting the proposal of the Marquis de Chat, who had rather charmingly confessed to her that he wasn't really a nobleman at all, but a poor boy made good. I owe it all, he told her, to my pussy. I'm glad I've never had cause to say that. Still, in your case, many a true word, eh? Thanks. She slipped on the proffered ring. Don't tell anybody until I'm ready, please. Cheers! She left him beaming. Goodness, she thought, so many broken hearts in one day. A shadow fell over her, and a familiar hissing and booing sound filled the air. Bernice quickly whipped off the new ring, added it to the others, and turned around, holding the correct finger out. Ah, my dear Vizier, I've heard that you've got a bit of a crush on me. Tell me more. He took the dwarves and me back to his castle. Wolsey was getting into the swing of it now, leaping about the stage and declaiming at the prince, who was looking down at his boots and generally affecting not to notice. He had his people deal with every hassle, which was kind. He thought that Dick was actually a woman, a strange position even for a human. but in very little time. I thought I'll never be like human people. I'll never do whatever human people do. I'll never work out human people. I'll never work out human people like you." He pointed a claw flirtatiously at Puss in the audience, who just shrugged. "I'll never understand, so I just smile and lent a hand." Bernice bit her bottom lip, and managed a cheery smile as the vizier kissed her knuckle, admiring the ring that he had placed on it. He paused to wipe a tear from his eye. "I'm overcome," he told her. "Normally I have to force my brides into marriage through threats to the men they actually love. I've never had this degree of cooperation." He suddenly turned his head to look over Bernice's shoulder and grinned an insane grin, seemingly in response to one of the strange noises that followed him around. "Oh, shut up. I'm trying to be sincere." The noises only increased in volume. Bernice was about to ask him just what he was on about when there came a shout from the other side of the room. "Leave her alone!" Standing on the balcony in front of an open window stood a teenage Arabic boy, his hands on his hips. Even from here, Bernice could spot the by now familiar lack of anything masculine in the neck department. "I've come to rescue you, princess." The crowd gasped and cried out as the boy leapt off the balcony, grasped the great chandelier above the dance floor, and swung himself over their heads, letting go of the light fitting to spin 3 times before landing right between Bernice and the vizier. The band stopped playing, gawping at the intruder. Wolsey put his hands on his hips and sighed in disgust. The Arabian boy slapped his thigh and thrust his prodigious chest out at the vizier. "So, you thought you could force her to marry you, eh?" "Oh, no," purred the vizier. "Not this time. She was quite keen, weren't you?" He nodded at Bernice, seeking confirmation. The boy grabbed Bernice by the shoulders as she desperately tried to pull the ring from her finger. "Is this true?" Yes, actually, but..." The ring came off, and Bernice dropped it down her bodice to join the others. "I've really gone off the idea now and want to marry you instead." "What?" cried the vizier, the prince, the marquis, Jack, John Wood, and most of the assembled courtiers. Bernice broke from the boy's grasp, gathered up her skirts, and jumped on stage beside Wolsey. "In fact, quick, men!" Robert of Huntingdon leapt to his feet and gestured to the musicians. "This is the distraction we've been waiting for." The musicians threw aside their hooded cloaks, revealing bright green jerkins and tights. They pulled bows, staves, and swords from their instruments. "So," the king laughed scornfully, glancing at Marion, "you have led this vagabond straight into my trap." From alcoves all around the roof of the hall appeared men in armour, armed with crossbows. The king drew his sword. Robert drew his sword. They leapt onto the long dining table. "Stop!" bellowed Bernice. They stopped. The room fell silent. Everybody was looking at her, including the 2 swordsmen poised to fight. Bernice glanced upwards. Above the stage, the giant clock was indicating 20 seconds to midnight. She had that terrible feeling in the pit of her stomach again. It would be terribly easy to go along with any one of these stories, to give in to one particular suitor, or play along with this sudden, desperate attempt to launch into a new situation. But that would mean the end, and Bernice was certain that, if that happened, nobody was going to live happily ever after. This knotting of stories felt even worse, as if a terrible pressure was on her, the room, and everybody in it, as if the world was about to explode. Wolsey was looking around desperately. He was feeling it too, an electric sensation, as if they were all about to be ripped apart by lightning. But she had to go through with it. She didn't belong here. She was Bernice Summerfield, and if this world couldn't accept that, then she was going to pull it down with her. "Your Majesty," she shouted, "I want to marry all of them, every single one. How's that for closure?" The king gawped at her, his mouth moving, unable to say anything. Give us your blessing. Bring all these stories to an end. Bernice held his stare with her own. Do it! I give, the king stammered, dropping his sword as the table beneath him shuddered. The whole room was shuddering now, as if it was on the verge of some vast climactic implosion. Wolsey grabbed Bernice's arm. What have you done? What's happening to my world? The shuddering became vibration. The courtiers started screaming and throwing themselves to the floor as every piece of glass in the hall shattered into powder. And still the vibration became faster, the walls and floor and ceiling screaming with it. The second hand on the clock, battering against the body of the clock itself, clicked to midnight. The clock chimed, and the room erupted into white light. A moment of dislocation. Nothing. And then something again. The clock was still chiming. 2, 3, 4 chimes and continuing. Bernice stood on the stage as she had before, and all the courtiers were staring at her. Because her beautiful dress was becoming grey at the edges, the gems in her hair falling and fluttering off as leaves, her bodice unravelling into a slapping spiral of vines. She felt a wave of emotion rush over her, and she couldn't tell how much of it was what this world expected her to feel, and how much of it was the horror that she actually felt. That she'd failed, that she'd lost, that she was going to be trapped in this insane world forever. Howling, she jumped off the stage and ran for the great doors at the end of the hall, clutching the remains of her dress to her body. She tripped and rolled down the steps of the castle, sobbing as everything unravelled around her, her elbows and knees bruised on the muddy marble. But what did that matter? They'd be healed in tomorrow's perfect sleep. And then there'd be tomorrow, and tomorrow, until she was a perfect, grinning inhabitant of this hell. The slippers slipped from her feet and bounced away. Her body slapped into the mud at the bottom of the steps, and she was not surprised at all when a pair of strong hands helped her to her feet. This world demanded that you play, that you could not even madly sulk in a corner. It kept at you like a weasel, which was exactly what was helping her into a rather smelly orange carriage. A weasel in a footman's outfit that was unravelling as fast as her own. "Quickly!" he called. "I don't care," Bernice bellowed at him as she fell into the carriage. "This isn't real." The footman leapt onto the front of the carriage, grabbed the reins, and thwacked them, causing the horse to bolt forward. The horse, Bernice observed, on the edge of a laugh that would have consumed her and gone on forever, was the same strange one as she'd seen in the column of the prince's soldiers outside the cottage. It looked like it had been sewn together out of 2 horses, attached at the middle. Of course. What could you say here but, of course? She slapped her hands to her mouth, realizing that she'd begun to hyperventilate. Then she took them away again, enjoying the fast and terrible breaths. This world wouldn't let her die. It needed her to be a character for it. The coach swept around 3 bends, down 2 roads, and into the drive of a large house, throwing mud up with its sudden cornering. It just about made it up the drive before it transformed into a bouncing collection of fruit. Bernice found herself rolling over and over, her arms wrapped around a pumpkin. She flew through an open door and bounced down a flight of stairs, the rest of the vegetables, plus a collection of chittering small animals, racing down there with her. She finally thumped to a halt, dressed in rags, all the breath knocked out of her, against a cold fireplace. The pumpkin hit the wall beside her and exploded into goo, covering her. The little creatures, including the weasel, slumped beside her. Bernice put her hands to her face. She could say something funny. She could abandon herself to crying and laughing and madness. Or she could try to rip her eyes out, hit her head against the wall, anything to escape the hand of certainty that had grabbed her from the ball and thrown her here when she had tried to act against it. She pulled her hands from her face on the verge of decision. The horse, which was still a horse, made its way down the stairs and stopped in front of her. It separated into two sections, a front and a back. The man in the back section stood up. The man in the front section stood up and took the horse's head off. "We," he said, "are on a mission from God." "This time," Bernice whispered, "you have my full attention."